Usually when we talk about diagnosing a massive systemic problem, there's this underlying assumption that we can just treat it like engineering.
Right, like society is just a machine you can fix.
Yeah, exactly. Or, I don't know, like medicine, like you break your arm, the x-ray shows you a jagged white line on a black background, and the doctor just points at the film.
And says, well, there's the fracture.
Right. It's visible,
Yeah.
it's completely quantifiable, and, because it's quantifiable, it feels solvable.
Which provides a really profound sense of comfort. I mean, human beings are deeply unsettled by ambiguity. So we lean heavily on this idea that if we can just categorize a problem...
You can just map it out.
Yeah, map it out, attach data to it. The solution will just naturally reveal itself.
But then you step into the world of sociology.
Oh, yeah. That changes everything.
Specifically, the sociology of systemic racism in post-Civil War America.
Yeah.
And suddenly, that x-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Completely useless. The diagnostic landscape is murky, it's violent, and it absolutely refuses to behave rationally.
Right. But I want you, the listener, to imagine being this brilliant, Harvard-educated scientist in the late 1890s.
Okay.
You are detached, you are highly analytical, and you are completely, fundamentally convinced that if you just present the empirical, undeniable mathematical truth that racism is scientifically illogical,
that society will just look at your spreadsheet, apologize, and fix itself.
Exactly. It's wild to think about now, but that was the mindset.
Well, it's a remarkably pure expression of Enlightenment-era philosophy, really.
How so?
It's this absolute faith that humans are, at their core, rational actors. It's the belief that prejudice is merely a symptom of ignorance.
So if you cure the ignorance...
Right, if you eradicate the ignorance with cold, hard facts, the prejudice simply must collapse under its own illogical weight.
Okay, so you are the scientist. You are armed with your data, and you are walking down a dirt road toward a newspaper office in Atlanta.
This is the spring of 1899.
Right. And you're carrying a letter you've meticulously drafted. You are going to sit down with a newspaper editor to logically discuss a recent horrific event.
The lynching of a black man named Sam House.
Yes. You genuinely believe you can reason with the press. But as you walk down the street, you pass a local grocery store.
And this is the moment that changes everything.
It really is. Displayed right there in the storefront window, arranged like, I don't know, common merchandise for the public to gawk at?
Yeah.
Or the severed, burned knuckles of Sam House.
It's just the psychological impact of that moment is almost impossible to overstate.
I can't even fathom it.
It was this visceral, grotesque intrusion of absolute barbarism right into this man's highly ordered academic world.
And in that singular fraction of a second, looking through that pane of glass, the illusion of the rational world just shatters.
Completely shatters.
The realization isn't just terrifying. It completely upends his entire life's work up to that point. He realizes that truth alone is powerless.
Right. You cannot be a calm, cool, detached scientist in a laboratory while your people are literally being hunted in the streets.
Exactly. The cure for society's disease isn't just telling people the truth. The cure is forcing them to act on it.
And that profound shift, from passive observation to aggressive action, is the exact catalyst for the man we are examining in today's deep dive.
That moment in Atlanta redefined American history because it redefined him.
We are, of course, talking about W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes, and just to set the record straight from the jump here, because I know people get this wrong all the time, he was incredibly insistent on the pronunciation of his name.
Oh, fiercely insistent.
It is Du Bois with a hard accent on the last syllable.
Yeah, he spent his entire life patiently, and sometimes not so patiently, correcting people who tried to use the French pronunciation Du Bois.
Right, because of the spelling.
Exactly. He would tell them he was an American, born in Massachusetts, and his name was pronounced accordingly.
So welcome to the deep dive. We're going to track the massive 95-year epic of his life today.
And it really is an epic.
It is. And this isn't just a biography. This is a story that literally spans from the smoke clearing after the Civil War all the way to the eve of the 1963 March on Washington.
The scope of his life is staggering.
So if you've ever looked at a broken institution and asked yourself, do I try to reform this from the inside by playing their game, or do I completely tear the building down from the outside?
Then W.E.B. Du Bois is your ultimate case study.
Absolutely. We have a huge stack of historical sources to go through today. So let's start with the environment that shaped his early mind.
Let's do it.
It's 1868. He's in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He's born to a single mother, Mary Sylvina Burgart. What kind of world is this kid actually stepping into?
Well, the environment of Great Barrington in the mid-19th century is absolutely critical to understanding his later internal conflicts.
How so?
It was a predominantly white New England town, but it possessed this surprising degree of integration and tolerance for the era.
Really? Even back then?
Yeah, his family, the Burgerts, had deep established roots there. His maternal great-great-grandfather, Tom Burgart, was born in West Africa, was enslaved by a Dutch colonist in the Hudson Valley,
Oh, well.
and likely secured his freedom by serving in the Continental Army during the American Revolution.
Wait, so his family isn't just newly emancipated. They have generational ties to the founding of the country itself.
Precisely. They were part of the fabric of this New England community. And on his father's side, Alfred Dubois had a complex lineage of ethnic French-American, Huguenot, and Bahamian ancestry.
But his dad wasn't really around, right?
No, Alfred was a very fleeting presence. He left the family when William was only 2 years old.
So it's just him and his mom.
Right. So young William is raised primarily by his mother, Mary, who worked tirelessly, and they were supported by this network of extended family and sympathetic white neighbors.
Yeah, I read from our sources that his childhood sounds almost uniquely sheltered, especially compared to the nightmare of the post-Reconstruction South.
It was a completely different universe.
I mean, he's attending an integrated public school, he's playing with white classmates, his teachers are actually recognizing his intellect and actively pushing him to study classical literature.
And the local congregational church even chips in to raise the money to send him to college.
That's wild. It seems like he was raised in an environment that actively reinforced the idea that meritocracy was real.
It functioned as an incubator. The town treated him largely as an individual with potential rather than solely through the lens of a racial caste system.
Did he experience any racism there at all?
Oh, he wasn't completely shielded from it, of course. There were subtle alienations and slights, things he wrote about later, but he didn't experience the systemic, violent suppression of the South.
Right.
And that incubator, that belief in a meritocratic reality created a massive psychological vulnerability for him.
Because eventually he has to leave Great Barrington.
Exactly.
He goes to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee in 1885. This is a historically black college right in the heart of the Deep South. I can't even fathom the psychological whiplash of that transition. How does a kid whose white neighbors bought his college books process the reality of 1880s Tennessee?
It was a brutal foundational shock. When he stepped off that train in Nashville, he wasn't just entering a different region, he was entering a different reality. This was his first direct immersive exposure to the mechanical realities of Jim Crow.
And we use that term Jim Crow pretty loosely today, right?
Yeah, we do. But for Dubois, it meant witnessing a highly organized system of racial terror.
Give me some examples of what he's actually seeing.
It meant seeing voter suppression enforced by armed mobs. It meant economic peonage, where black farmers were trapped in endless debt cycles by white landowners.
Basically slavery by another name.
Exactly. And the constant looming threat of lynching as a primary tool of social control.
So instead of a town that nurtures his intellect, he's in a state where his very existence, if he steps out of line, is practically criminalized.
And this dual experience, the relative egalitarianism of New England versus the violent caste system of the South, forge a very unique perspective.
Because he knows what it's like on the other side.
Exactly. He knew fundamentally what it felt like to be treated as a human being with potential. Because he had experienced that baseline of dignity, the systemic degradation of the South didn't feel like a natural, inevitable order to him.
It felt like a trap.
It felt like a manufactured, deeply unnatural aberration that just needed to be dismantled.
And his response to that realization is to just arm himself with education.
He becomes obsessed with it.
So after Fisk, he heads to Harvard. And Harvard, being Harvard, refuses to accept his Fisk credits.
Of course they did.
So they make him start his bachelor's degree all over again.
Which is incredibly insulting, but he just puts his head down.
He hustles his way through summer jobs, scholarships, loans. He ends up becoming the very first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard.
An unbelievable achievement for the time.
But it's his time studying abroad in Berlin that really caught my attention in the source material. How does late 19th century Germany shape his worldview?
So his time at the University of Berlin in the early 1890s was another massive paradigm shift.
Why Berlin specifically?
Because German academia at the time was the global epicenter of the social sciences. He was studying under the foundational architects of sociology and economics.
Right.
He even crossed paths with Max Weber, one of the most important sociologists in history.
And how did they treat him? Because he's an African-American man in 1890s Germany.
That's what's remarkable. Weber and the German intellectual elite didn't view Dubois as some sort of subhuman curiosity. They viewed him as a peer.
Wow.
In fact, Weber was so deeply impressed by Dubois' intellect that he later used Dubois' work as a primary counterargument against European academics who were pushing theories of biological racial inferiority.
That has to be mind-bending for him.
Oh, absolutely.
He's treated as a second-class citizen in his own country, but he goes to Europe, and the greatest minds of the age are using him as the gold standard of intellectual capability.
It completely reinforced his deepest Enlightenment convictions. It proved to him that American racism was not some global default, but a specific, localized pathology.
A disease he could cure.
Exactly. So he returned to the United States armed with the absolute cutting-edge methodologies of German sociological research, determined to apply them to the American race problem.
Which brings us to 1899 and the Philadelphia Negro.
Yes, his first major project.
He gets hired by the University of Pennsylvania to conduct a sociological field study of Philadelphia's African-American neighborhoods, specifically the 7th Ward.
Right.
And we say he pioneered urban sociology, but I really want to dig into the actual mechanics of what he did, because he didn't have a computer.
Yeah.
He didn't have statistical software. So how is he actually gathering and processing all this data?
The methodology was painstakingly granular. I mean, the University of Pennsylvania essentially gave him a tiny apartment in the middle of the slums and very little institutional support.
Typical.
Yeah. So Dubois personally walked the streets of the 7th Ward. He knocked on doors. He conducted over 5,000 personal interviews.
5,000, just him.
Just him. He was asking about household income, family structure, occupations, illness, crime, and education. He was essentially acting as a one-man census bureau.
I mean, I imagine knocking on 5,000 doors in a marginalized community and asking deeply personal financial and legal questions wasn't exactly easy. How did he overcome the obvious suspicion?
It required an immense amount of social dexterity. He had to convince a deeply skeptical, heavily policed population that this suited, Harvard-educated academic with a clipboard wasn't there to turn them into the authorities.
Right, because why else would a guy in a suit be asking about your income?
Exactly. He had to show them he was there to scientifically document their reality to help them.
And once he gets all this data, what does he do with it?
Yeah. He began cross-referencing it. He mapped the neighborhood street by street, color-coding households by social class and economic status.
So what was the ultimate conclusion of all this mapping? What was the specific narrative he was trying to disrupt?
Well, at the time, the prevailing white societal narrative was that the poverty, crime, and high mortality rates in black neighborhoods were proof of inherent racial inferiority.
The argument was basically, look at these slums, this is just how these people naturally are.
Right. But Dubois used his data to mathematically isolate the variables. He proved that the conditions in the 7th Ward were the direct, mathematically predictable result of external forces.
Like what kind of forces?
Systemic housing segregation, aggressive exclusion from trade unions, and the lingering generational trauma of slavery.
So he's saying it's the environment, not the people.
Yes. He demonstrated that if you take any population, regardless of race, and subject them to those specific economic chokeholds, you will produce the exact same social outcomes.
I'm trying to put myself in his shoes here. He has just produced a masterwork of empirical research. He has definitively, mathematically proven that the societal decay is caused by the system, not the people.
And he's incredibly proud of it.
He must have thought, here it is, I've solved the equation. Now the politicians just need to read this and change the laws.
That was exactly his operating theory. He genuinely believed that if you illuminate the mechanics of a problem with flawless data, rational men in power will be compelled by their own reason to correct it.
Which brings us right back to the burned knuckles of Sam Hose in that Atlanta storefront.
The shattering of the illusion.
The reality of a lynching. Because a lynching isn't a misunderstanding of data. A lynching is an intentional theatrical display of terror designed to maintain a racial hierarchy.
Exactly.
You cannot hand a spreadsheet to a lynch mob.
No, you can't. The lynching of Sam Hose proved to Du Bois that American racism wasn't a problem of ignorance. It was a problem of power, economic incentive, and deeply ingrained psychological supremacy.
Data is completely useless against a society that actively enjoys its own sickness.
And that realization is profound.
So he realizes the laboratory is compromised. He needs to step out of the role of the detached scientist and become an agitator.
Needs a movement.
And this brings us into the dawn of the 1900s. If he's going to build a movement, he has to define the ideology. And he does this in 1903 with a monumental collection of 14 essays.
The Souls of Black Folk.
Yes. Let's talk about this book.
The Souls of Black Folk is arguably one of the most important texts in American literature. It fundamentally shifted the entire vocabulary of the civil rights struggle.
And it's in this book that he introduces the concept of double consciousness, right?
Yes, which is absolutely central to understanding the psychological burden of race in America.
I want to make sure we really understand double consciousness. It's often quoted as two warring ideals in one dark body.
That's the famous line.
But practically speaking, is it sort of like trying to run two completely conflicting operating systems, like an old Windows and a Mac system, on the same computer motherboard at the exact same time?
That is a phenomenal analogy.
Thank you.
Imagine your brain is the computer hardware. One operating system is your identity as an American, the ideals of liberty, ambition, the pursuit of happiness, the belief that hard work yields reward.
Right.
But the other operating system is your identity as a Black person in a white supremacist society, which is constantly feeding you error messages.
Like, you don't belong here.
Exactly. You don't belong. You are a threat. You are inferior.
And because you're forced to run both of these systems simultaneously, it's just completely draining the battery of your soul. You're constantly having to view yourself not just through your own eyes, but through the hostile gaze of the society around you.
Precisely. It is a state of perpetual psychological exhaustion. You're constantly translating your own existence to make it palatable to a dominant culture that despises you.
Man, that is heavy.
It is. And Du Bois argued that the ultimate goal of the Black American struggle wasn't to choose one system over the other, to assimilate entirely or separate entirely, but to merge them.
To be able to be both African and American.
Yes, without having the doors of opportunity slammed in your face.
Now, in that same book, he also fully articulates his strategy for how to achieve this, which he calls the talented 10th.
Ah, yes, the talented 10th.
And this is where things get a bit prickly for a modern reader. The concept is that the intellectual elite, the top 10% of the African American community, are the ones tasked with uplifting the rest of the race.
Right.
He argues they need advanced classical liberal arts education to become philosophers, lawyers, and leaders.
Right.
But I have to ask, isn't that inherently elitist?
It is entirely and unabashedly elitist.
It sounds like he's saying that 90% of the population is basically helpless and needs to be rescued by a vanguard of Ivy League graduates.
And it's one of the great complexities of his early philosophy. Look, Du Bois was a product of elite institutions, and he viewed the world through an academic hierarchy.
Right, he was a Harvard guy.
Exactly. He wrote about the poor Black underclass, whom he sometimes referred to as the submerged 10th, with a tone that could border on condescension.
Wow, the submerged 10th.
Yeah. He acknowledged that their condition was the fault of slavery, but he did not believe that the masses possessed the intellectual discipline required to engineer their own liberation.
It's the idea that if a train is stuck, you don't try to push it from the back cars. You build a massive, powerful engine at the front to pull the whole thing forward.
That is exactly how he saw it. But this philosophy, this demand for classical higher education and a fighting intellectual elite, put him on a direct, explosive collision course with the most powerful Black man in America at that time.
Booker T. Washington.
Yes.
We have to unpack this rivalry, because this isn't just some polite academic disagreement. This was an existential battle for the soul and strategy of Black America.
It was war.
Booker T. Washington was the principal of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and he was the architect of what became known as the Atlanta Compromise.
Which was incredibly controversial.
I want to break down exactly what this compromise was, because it wasn't like a signed treaty, right? It was an unwritten, highly strategic social contract. How did the Atlanta Compromise actually function mechanically?
So the Atlanta Compromise, which Washington articulated in a very famous 1895 speech, was essentially a massive geopolitical bargain struck with the white Southern power structure and Northern white philanthropists.
Okay, so what were the actual terms of the deal?
The mechanics were this. Washington publicly conceded that Southern Black people would not agitate for voting rights, they would not demand integration, and they would accept the social humiliation of Jim Crow.
Basically, they would stay in their place.
Exactly.
And what do they get in return for literally locking themselves in the basement?
In return, the white power structure would theoretically stop the mass lynchings, provide basic legal justice, and most importantly, allow Black people to receive industrial and agricultural education.
Ah, so vocational schools.
Right. And the Northern industrialists, who wanted a docile, stable workforce in the South, would heavily fund these vocational schools, like Tuskegee.
So Washington's argument was that political rights were useless if you were starving.
Exactly. He wanted to build an independent economic base of Black farmers, mechanics, and tradesmen. Once they had economic power, he theorized, political rights would naturally follow.
It sounds like a hostage negotiation where the hostage says, look, I won't try to escape, just please let me learn how to farm so I can feed my family.
That's a very stark way to put it, but yes.
I mean, I have to push back on the idea that Washington was just a total sellout, though. He was operating in the Deep South during the peak of post-Reconstruction racial terror.
It was a bloodbath.
Right. Thousands of people were being murdered. Wasn't his strategy just the ultimate form of desperate survival?
That is the essential defense of Booker T. Washington. He was playing a long, quiet, incredibly dangerous game of survival in a literal war zone.
Okay.
But Du Bois looked at the mechanics of the Atlanta Compromise and saw a fatal flaw.
Which was?
Du Bois argued that if you voluntarily surrender your political rights, the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, you have absolutely no mechanism to protect your economic gains.
Oh.
If a Black farmer becomes successful, what stops a white mob from simply stealing his land if he has no political voice to demand justice?
And history proved Du Bois completely right on that front. The lynchings didn't stop. They actually increased.
Because economic success without political protection just makes you a target.
Du Bois argued that surrendering human dignity for a paycheck permanently cements your status as a subordinate caste.
Exactly.
So how does Du Bois actually fight back against Washington? Because from what I understand, Washington controlled the Tuskegee machine.
He did. He was incredibly powerful.
Which meant he controlled the funding from Northern white donors and basically dictated which Black newspapers got advertising revenue.
Washington could destroy you economically if you crossed him.
So what's Du Bois' move?
Du Bois realized he couldn't just debate Washington, he had to out-organize him. And he was incredibly creative in how he fought this ideological war.
Let's talk about the 1900 Paris Exposition, because this is a fascinating example.
It really is. Du Bois was tasked with creating an exhibit representing the American Negro.
Yes. I absolutely love this detail from the sources. Instead of just bringing over some agricultural products to show that Black people were good workers.
Which is exactly what Washington would have done.
Right. Du Bois brings data, but he turns it into modernist art.
Yes.
He creates this exhibit of 363 photographs of affluent, educated, beautifully dressed African Americans. But he also creates these massive, hand-drawn, brilliantly colored sociological charts and graphs.
They look like abstract art pieces.
They really do. He's plotting out property ownership, literacy rates, and business growth, and he wins a gold medal for it.
It was a brilliant subversion of the global narrative. I mean, European audiences were accustomed to seeing Black people depicted in grotesque, racist caricatures, or at best, as humble peasants.
Right.
Du Bois presented them with empirical proof of a sophisticated, modern, intellectual Black society. He was broadcasting the reality of the talented 10th to the entire world.
But, charts in Paris don't stop bullets in Georgia.
No, they don't.
The violence is escalating. In 1906, there's a horrific race riot in Atlanta where white mobs roamed the streets, murdering dozens of Black citizens.
It was devastating.
Du Bois is terrified. He writes this agonizing poem called A Litany at Atlanta, where he basically screams at God, saying, "We submitted to the Atlanta Compromise, we kept our heads down, and they are still slaughtering us."
It breaks the final thread of his patience.
He knows he needs a structured, militant organization.
Yeah.
Which leads directly to the founding of the NAACP.
The creation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909 is a watershed moment.
Who else was involved in founding it?
Du Bois joins forces with a coalition of civil rights activists, including several prominent white liberals and Jewish activists who were appalled by the rising tide of racial violence.
Like the 1908 Springfield race riot, right?
Yes, specifically that riot in Illinois, which was Abraham Lincoln's hometown, ironically enough.
It's important to note, though, that while Du Bois was a founding member, The early executive board was predominantly white.
Yes, they were relying very heavily on white philanthropy.
But they offered Dubois a crucial role. They make him the director of publicity and research, and more importantly, they give him control of the organization's new monthly magazine.
The crisis.
Yes, the crisis.
And the crisis becomes Dubois's ultimate weapon. He finally has his megaphone.
How big did he get?
Under his editorial control, the magazine was an absolute phenomenon. By the end of the 1910s, it had a circulation of over 100,000 copies a month.
Wow, that's massive for that era.
It was read in barbershops, churches, and living rooms across the entire country.
How did he use the crisis mechanically? Was it just opinion pieces?
It was a multifaceted attack. He used it to highlight Black artistic and literary achievements, effectively launching the careers of many Harlem Renaissance writers.
Oh, that's cool.
But its most vital function was as a relentless, unforgiving spotlight on the horrors of lynching.
Because the mainstream press wasn't covering it.
Exactly. The mainstream white press routinely ignored lynchings, or even worse, they blamed the victims. Du Bois used the crisis to conduct actual investigative journalism.
This is where we have to talk about the Waco horror in 1916, because this really proves he wasn't just some ivory tower academic. He understood the raw power of media.
Yes, this is a very dark but important piece of the history.
Walk us through what happened.
A 17-year-old mentally impaired Black youth named Jesse Washington was brutally tortured and lynched by a massive mob in Waco, Texas.
Awful.
The local authorities were entirely complicit, and the local press treated the lynching like a civic celebration.
So what does Du Bois do?
He hired a white suffragist and investigator named Elizabeth Freeman to go undercover in Waco.
Wow, a white woman undercover.
Yes. She gathered first-hand accounts, and crucially, she secured horrific photographs taken by a local photographer during the lynching.
And Du Bois publishes these photos in the crisis.
Yes. It's a massive, multi-page spread detailing the complicity of the mayor, the police, and the citizens.
It completely bypassed the local cover-up and forced the entire nation to look at the sheer, undeniable savagery of the event.
It was a pioneering use of visual media to shock the national conscience.
He is building massive momentum here. He's defining the civil rights struggle, but then a global catastrophe throws a massive wrench into his strategy.
World War I.
Yes.
World War I presented an excruciating dilemma for the Black community. The United States was entering a global conflict to make the world safe for democracy, while simultaneously denying basic democratic rights to millions of its own citizens.
Right. The debate was fierce. Do we fight for a country that lynches us, or do we refuse and risk being labeled as traitors?
Exactly.
I am really struggling to understand his logic here, though. Du Bois knows the military is deeply racist. The War Department forcibly retires Colonel Charles Young, the highest-ranking Black officer in the Army, on completely fabricated medical grounds.
Just so a white officer wouldn't have to take orders from him.
Exactly.
Yep.
Black drafted soldiers are being treated like pack animals. So how does a genius like Du Bois convince himself that supporting this war is a good idea? What leverage did he think he had?
It was a brutal calculation of real politics.
Explain that.
Du Bois's close ally at the NAACP, a white man named Joel Spingarn, was working to establish a segregated officer training camp for Black men. The War Department basically offered a quid pro quo.
What was the deal?
They said, we will allow 1,000 Black men to be commissioned as officers, but we need the Black press to stop criticizing the war effort.
Wow. Spingarn leaned heavily on Du Bois.
He did.
So it's a hostage negotiation, just like Booker T. Washington's.
In many ways, yes, it was. Du Bois wrote the infamous Close Ranks editorial in June 1918. He told African Americans to forget their special grievances and stand shoulder to shoulder with white citizens to win the war.
He calculated that if Black men bled on the battlefields of Europe, if they proved their ultimate loyalty and patriotism, the United States government would be morally and politically obligated to grant them full citizenship upon their return.
He essentially tried to buy civil rights with the blood of Black soldiers.
And the tragedy is the check completely bounced.
It was a total, catastrophic failure of trust.
What happened when the war ended?
When Du Bois traveled to Europe after the war to document the Black troop experience, he uncovered massive systemic abuse.
By the American military.
Yes. The military had relegated the vast majority of Black soldiers to menial labor as stevedores, just unloading ships.
What about the combat units? Like the Harlem Hellfighters?
The combat units that did fight were loaned out to the French army because the American command refused to fight alongside them.
That's just wild.
Worse, the American military actively circulated memos to the French, warning them not to treat black soldiers as equals, lest they get uppity ideas.
And when these soldiers returned home, carrying a new sense of pride, this idea of the new Negro who had fought for global democracy and wasn't going to accept Jim Crow anymore, they weren't greeted with ticker tape parades.
No, they were greeted with the Red Summer of 1919.
Let's talk about the Red Summer.
Yeah.
Because it's horrific.
It was a horrific wave of racial violence, riots, and massacres that erupted in over 36 American cities. Hundreds of African Americans were killed.
But we need to understand the mechanics of why this explosion happened.
Yeah.
It wasn't just random hatred, right?
Yeah.
It was deeply economic.
Absolutely, because during the war, the Great Migration had started. 500,000 black people moved from the rural South to the industrial North to fill the factory jobs left behind by white men who had gone to fight.
And when those white soldiers returned, they found black men in their jobs and in their neighborhoods.
Exactly. Furthermore, Northern industrialists frequently used black workers as strike breakers to crush white labor unions, actively fomenting racial hatred to keep the working class divided.
So the white mobs attacked black neighborhoods to reassert economic and social dominance.
Right. In places like Elaine, Arkansas, nearly 200 black sharecroppers were massacred simply because they tried to form a union and hire a lawyer to review their exploitative crop contracts.
Du Bois observing all of this, and the betrayal absolutely hardens his soul.
It changes him fundamentally.
He writes an editorial called Returning Soldiers, and the tone is completely devoid of the close ranks compromise.
Oh, it's fiery.
He writes, "We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting, make way for democracy. We saved it in France, and by the great Jehovah, we will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why."
He is done playing the patriotic game,
The American establishment has proven to be entirely untrustworthy.
which forces him to look beyond the borders of the United States. If the American system is irredeemable from within, he must seek leverage from the outside.
And this pivots us into the 1920s and his embrace of global Pan-Africanism.
Yes, the global state.
Let's define Pan-Africanism practically, because it's a big word that gets thrown around. What does it actually mean in the 1920s context?
Mechanically, Pan-Africanism is the political ideology that all people of African descent, whether on the continent or in the diaspora like the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, share a common destiny and a common oppressor in European colonialism.
So it's uniting everyone globally.
Right. Du Bois began organizing a series of Pan-African congresses in Europe. The goal was to bring together black intellectuals and leaders from across the globe to petition the major world powers.
Give me an example of what they were petitioning for.
Well, after World War I, the victorious nations are dividing up the old German colonies in Africa. Du Bois and his Congress issued the London Resolutions demanding that the newly formed League of Nations administer these territories with the explicit goal of transitioning them to self-rule by the native Africans.
Let me guess. The imperial powers ignored them.
Naturally, Britain, France, and the United States completely ignored them. The European empires had absolutely no intention of dismantling their lucrative colonial systems.
But while Du Bois was trying to build this intellectual diplomatic coalition abroad, he found himself facing a massive populist threat right in his own backyard.
A huge threat.
A man who had captured the imagination of the black working class in a way Du Bois never, ever could.
Marcus Garvey?
We are talking about Marcus Garvey. And the feud between Du Bois and Garvey is legendary.
It really is.
It is vicious, it is petty, and it is fundamentally ideological.
Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican immigrant, a phenomenal orator, and the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA.
How did Garvey's movement actually work?
Where Du Bois was analytical and elite, Garvey was highly theatrical and populist.
You wore those military uniforms, right?
Yes, elaborate uniforms. Garvey recognized that the black masses were exhausted by the slow, grinding, legalistic approach of the NAACP.
They wanted action now.
Garvey didn't want integration. He believed that white people would never willingly share power. Therefore, his ideology was total racial separatism and black nationalism.
He told black people to build their own factories, their own grocery stores,
and ultimately to look toward returning to Africa to build a global superpower. He even launched the Black Star Line, which was an all-Black-owned shipping corporation funded by selling tiny shares to working-class Black families.
It's an incredibly empowering message if you're a working-class person who is just tired of begging for a seat at the white man's table.
Exactly.
Garvey's essentially saying, we'll build our own table.
But Dubois looks at Garvey and is absolutely horrified.
He calls Garvey the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and the world. Why was he so threatened by Garvey?
Well, because Garvey's separatism fundamentally undermined the NAACP's mission of integration and civil rights.
It's going the exact opposite direction.
Right. Furthermore, Dubois viewed Garvey's business ventures, like the Black Star Line, as poorly managed, fraudulent schemes that were scamming poor Black people out of their hard-earned money.
Were there other underlying issues between them?
Yes. There was an undeniable element of colorism and classism at play. Garvey, who was dark-skinned, frequently attacked Dubois and the NAACP leadership as light-skinned elites who secretly just wanted to assimilate into white society.
And how did Dubois view Garvey?
Dubois viewed Garvey as a bombastic, uneducated demagogue.
Fascinating. I mean, earlier in his life, Dubois fought Booker T. Washington because Washington was too conservative, too willing to submit to white supremacy.
Yes.
Now, 20 years later, he is fighting Marcus Garvey because Garvey is too radical, too eager to completely separate from white society.
Dubois is trying to thread this impossibly tiny needle here. He wants full integration within the American system, but he also wants aggressive anti-imperialism on a global scale.
It's a two-front war.
It is, and he was highly effective when deployed in intellectual combat.
Which brings us to a remarkable moment in 1929, his debate with Lothrop Stoddard.
Oh, this is a great moment.
It's a masterclass in rhetorical warfare. Let's set the stage for our listeners. Lothrop Stoddard is a prominent, Harvard-educated white supremacist, a known Ku Klux Klan sympathizer, and a massive proponent of eugenics.
The pseudoscience of racial breeding.
Right. He's written best-selling books warning about the rising tide of color. So the Chicago Forum Council invites both of them to debate this central question. Shall the Negro be encouraged to seek cultural equality?
It was a massive event. 5,000 people packed into the hall.
Wow.
Stoddard comes out and delivers a highly aggressive, bombastic speech, essentially arguing that Black people are biologically incapable of contributing to advanced civilization and must be kept separate for the biological safety of the white race.
And how does Dubois respond? Because if someone said that to my face, I'd be screaming at them.
Well, Dubois didn't scream. He understood that anger would be framed by the white press as savage emotion.
So what did he do?
Instead, he deployed clinical, devastating, dry humor. He stood at the podium in his immaculate tuxedo, and he began to systematically dissect Stoddard's arguments, not by yelling, but by highlighting their absolute logical absurdity.
Well, that's brilliant.
He let Stoddard's own overconfident arrogance do the work for him.
I read the transcripts of this debate in the source material. He essentially sets up these little comedic traps, asking Stoddard to define Aryan or Nordic superiority. And as Stoddard tries to explain the unscientific nonsense, the audience starts chuckling.
Exactly.
Dubois just leans into a deadpan until the entire hall of 5,000 people is roaring with laughter at Stoddard.
Stoddard doesn't even realize he's the punchline until it's way too late.
The headlines the next day were incredible. 5,000 cheer W.E.B. Dubois, laugh at Lothrop Stoddard. He defeated white supremacy on stage with a smirk.
It demonstrated his profound intellectual confidence. But, you know, the applause of the 1920s was about to give way to the deepest crisis of the 20th century.
The Great Depression.
Yes. It hits in 1929, and it radically alters Dubois' economic philosophy, driving him toward a massive, painful schism.
We are entering the 1930s, the radical shift. The Great Depression is destroying the country, but it is absolutely devastating the Black working class.
Unemployment in some Black neighborhoods is over 50%.
The NAACP is struggling financially, and Dubois is constantly clashing with Walter White, the new executive secretary of the organization. But the real earthquake happens in 1934.
It was a shock to everyone.
Dubois publishes an editorial in The Crisis that completely stuns the civil rights world. He suggests that separate but equal, the legal justification for segregation, might actually be a necessary and acceptable goal for the immediate survival of Black America.
The NAACP board was utterly paralyzed by this. Their entire organizational mandate, their entire fundraising structure was based on fighting segregation.
And here is their founding father, their intellectual giant, seemingly throwing in the towel.
They demanded he retract the editorial.
Did he?
He flatly refused, and the conflict escalated until he officially resigned from the NAACP.
I really need to unpack this. The man who spent 30 years destroying the Atlanta Compromise, the man who destroyed Marcus Garvey for wanting separatism, is now saying, actually, segregation might be okay.
It looks like a complete contradiction.
It looks like he completely abandoned his principles. What is the actual mechanism behind his thinking here?
You have to view it through the lens of extreme, desperate economic pragmatism.
Okay, explain.
Du Bois had not suddenly decided that segregation was morally good. He recognized that the fight for integration was moving at a glacial pace, and in the meantime, the Great Depression was causing mass starvation.
Because white businesses refused to hire black workers.
Exactly. And white relief agencies were denying aid to black families. Du Bois argued that waiting for white morality to evolve was a luxury they could no longer afford.
So what was his solution?
He theorized that the black community had to immediately build its own internal cooperative economic systems. Black-owned farms supplying black-owned grocery stores supported by black-owned banks. If the white world was going to force them into a segregated box, they needed to make that box economically impenetrable just to survive the winter.
So it wasn't a surrender. It was a tactical retreat to build a fortress.
Okay.
Like, if they won't let us in the lifeboats, we have to build our own raft right now, or we drown.
Precisely. But the NAACP leadership viewed it as ideological heresy, so he was out.
He returns to academia at Atlanta University. And free from the editorial constraints of the NAACP, he produces what is arguably his greatest academic achievement.
Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935.
And this book is essentially a targeted missile aimed at the Dunning School of History. We need to explain what the Dunning School was, because it wasn't just a group of historians, it was a multi-generational academic PR campaign designed to rewrite the Civil War.
It was propaganda disguised as scholarship.
How did the Dunning School narrative function?
Named after Columbia University professor William Archibald Dunning, this school of thought dominated American textbooks and universities for the first half of the 20th century.
What did they teach?
It argued that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, but about states' rights.
Which is a myth we still hear today.
Yes, and more destructively, it argued that the Reconstruction era, the period after the war when black men were given the right to vote and hold office, was a tragic, corrupt mistake.
Why did they say it was a mistake?
The Dunning School taught that black people were inherently ignorant, lazy, and easily manipulated by corrupt Northern politicians. And they taught that the Southern white establishment, including groups like the Ku Klux Klan, were the noble redeemers who restored order and civilization.
It provided the intellectual, academic justification for Jim Crow laws. If black people ruined democracy during Reconstruction, then taking away their right to vote was just good governance.
Exactly. That was the lie being taught in every major university.
So how does Du Bois dismantle it?
He goes into the archives. He looks at the exact same primary sources the Dunning historians used, but he reads them accurately.
And what does he find?
He proved, with exhaustive documentation, that black enslaved people were central to the Union victory by engaging in massive general strikes, abandoning the plantations to weaken the Confederate economy.
Oh, that's brilliant.
He proved that during Reconstruction, black politicians and voters didn't ruin the South. They actually established the South's first universal public school systems.
Wow.
And they drafted progressive state constitutions that benefited poor whites as much as poor blacks. He completely restored black agency to the historical narrative.
He drops this absolute bombshell of historical truth.
Yeah.
And what does the mainstream white academic establishment do?
They almost entirely ignored it.
Are you kidding me?
Major historical journals refused to review it. The Dunning School narrative was too deeply embedded in the psychological comfort of the nation.
White America needed the myth of the tragic era to justify the ongoing subjugation of the black population.
Exactly. It wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1960s that historians finally caught up to Du Bois and recognized black Reconstruction as a masterpiece of revisionist history.
It's just infuriating. He provides the data again, and society ignores it again.
Which is a recurring theme in his life.
And you can see this pushing his economic and political views further and further to the radical left. He had visited the Soviet Union in 1926 and was deeply impressed by how the state seemingly prioritized the working class.
He starts reading Karl Marx.
And in 1936, he embarks on a world tour that produces some incredibly controversial, uncomfortable views.
Yes. His 1936 tour is a period of intense ideological complexity. He visits Nazi Germany.
And what does he say about that?
He actually expressed a degree of admiration for how the Nazi regime had organized the economy to pull the country out of the Depression.
Wow, okay.
But he was simultaneously horrified by the anti-Semitism. He saw exactly where it was heading, writing that the campaign against the Jews was a terrifying regression of civilization, comparing it directly to the horrors of the African slave trade.
So he sees the danger there. But his geopolitical analysis becomes truly controversial when he travels to Asia.
Yes.
He visits Japan and China, including Manchuria, which Japan had brutally occupied. And Du Bois actually views Imperial Japan's aggressive expansion favorably.
It's true.
He basically cheers for Japan as they build their empire, and later he opposes the United States entering World War II in the Pacific. I have a really hard time reconciling this.
It's very difficult to reconcile.
How does the man who spent his life fighting against oppression suddenly cheer for Imperial Japan, which was committing horrific atrocities in China?
To understand this, you have to look at the geopolitical chessboard through his specific, singular priority, which was the destruction of global white supremacy.
Okay, explain that.
Du Bois believed that Western capitalism and European colonialism were the ultimate foundational evils subjugating the majority of the planet's population.
Right.
He didn't endorse Japanese imperialism because he thought conquering other nations was a moral good. He endorsed it strictly from a position of anti-hegemonic realpolitik.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning Japan was the only non-white nation on Earth that had successfully industrialized and built a military capable of defeating white European empires.
So it's the ultimate extreme version of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. He's willing to overlook the atrocities Japan is committing against other Asians because Japan is breaking the myth of white Western invincibility.
Exactly. He viewed the outrage from America and Britain regarding Japanese expansion not as genuine moral concern for China, but as racist hypocrisy.
Oh, I see.
He essentially argued that the British and the French have been violently colonizing Africa and Asia for centuries, but the moment a non-white nation tries to build an empire, suddenly imperialism is a crime.
Wow. It is a dark, raw, deeply flawed pragmatism, but it shows how entirely consumed he was by the racial binary of global power.
It does, and this radicalism is starting to alienate him from the mainstream.
In 1943, at the age of 75, he is abruptly fired from Atlanta University. The academic world is shocked, he secures a pension, and in a wild twist, he goes back to work for the NAACP as the director of special research.
But he returns to a very different NAACP, one that is becoming heavily involved in the post-war international order.
Like the UN.
Yes. In 1945, he serves as part of the NAACP delegation to the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco.
And he immediately goes on the offensive.
Oh, absolutely. He drafts a proposal demanding that the UN explicitly commit to ending the global colonial system, arguing that colonialism is the root cause of global poverty and future wars.
And predictably, the major powers, the U.S., Britain, France, who are busy holding onto their colonies, completely ignore him.
Of course.
But the world is shifting. We are entering the 1950s. The Cold War is freezing the globe into two camps. And Du Bois's radical pragmatism, his sympathy for the Soviet Union, and his deep association with left-wing figures are about to put him in the crosshairs of the United States government.
The Cold War environment created a profound crisis within the American civil rights movement.
Why?
The NAACP was terrified of being labeled a communist front organization, which would have destroyed their funding and their political access in Washington. So they had to play it safe.
So under Walter White's leadership, the NAACP actively purged communists and distanced itself from the radical left. Du Bois, however, refused to compromise his associations.
He maintained close ties with prominent leftists, most notably the brilliant singer, actor, and activist Paul Robeson.
Yes.
But Du Bois wasn't actually a member of the Communist Party at this point, right?
Correct. He was deeply sympathetic to socialist economics. He believed Karl Marx had accurately diagnosed the predatory nature of capitalism, which Du Bois viewed as the engine driving both poverty and racism.
Right.
But he valued his intellectual independence too much to submit to the strict dictates of the Communist Party.
However, in the paranoid atmosphere of the late 1940s, mere sympathy was enough to make him radioactive.
Yes, it was.
So in 1948, the NAACP forces him out for the second and final time.
And he's 80 years old.
He's 80 years old, he's been exiled from the organization he founded, and instead of retiring quietly, he becomes a fierce international peace activist.
He just won't stop. He's traveling to Paris, to Moscow, giving these fiery speeches warning that the United States, driven by corporate greed and military industrial power, is marching the world toward a third world war.
And the FBI, which has been maintaining a massive file on him since 1942, decides it is time to shut him down.
McCarthy era is in full swing.
It is. The government is hunting for subversives. In 1950, Dubois becomes the chairman of a newly formed organization called the Peace Information Center.
And what did they do?
Their primary objective was circulating an international petition called the Stockholm Appeal, which demanded an absolute global ban on all nuclear weapons.
You know, a ban on nuclear weapons sounds pretty reasonable today, but during the Cold War, the U.S. government views that as a direct Soviet plot to disarm America.
Exactly. The Justice Department targeted the Peace Information Center, demanding that Dubois and the leadership register as agents of a foreign principal.
The implication being that they were taking orders directly from Moscow.
Right. Dubois and his colleagues flatly refused, stating they were independent American citizens advocating for world peace.
So the United States government officially indicts Dr. W.E.B. Dubois. He's 83 years old. He is handcuffed, fingerprinted, and faces up to 5 years in federal prison.
It's just staggering.
And what happens to his support network?
It evaporates. Many of his moderate middle-class black colleagues scatter out of fear of guilt by association.
What about the NAACP?
The NAACP board refuses to issue a statement of support or provide legal assistance. It was a staggering, heartbreaking betrayal. The man who gave them their voice was abandoned to the wolves.
But the radical left rallies. Working-class labor unions, left-wing intellectuals, and international figures start raising money for his defense.
Yes.
He goes on trial in federal court in Washington, D.C. in 1951, represented by a fiery left-wing civil rights attorney named Vito Marcantonio.
And this trial features one of the most incredible flexes in legal history.
I love this part.
The trial was a farce from the beginning, as the prosecution had zero actual evidence that the Peace Information Center was funded or directed by the Soviet Union. But the political pressure to convict was immense.
But then, Marcantonio, the defense attorney, stands up in the courtroom. He calmly informs the judge that the defense intends to call a character witness on behalf of Dr. Dubois.
And that witness is Dr. Albert Einstein.
The impact of that announcement was seismic. Albert Einstein was the most beloved, respected, and famous scientist on the planet.
He was a Jewish refugee who had fled the Nazis, and he was deeply sympathetic to the plight of African Americans, recognizing the terrifying parallels of systemic racism.
Just the threat of having Albert Einstein take the witness stand in front of the global press and tell the world that the United States government is persecuting an 83-year-old pacifist scholar.
The government panics.
The judge abruptly dismisses the case for lack of evidence before the defense even has to call a witness.
It was a brilliant tactical victory, but it was a Pyrrhic one. Because the government didn't send him to prison, but they found another way to silence him. They confiscated his passport and refused to issue him a new one for 8 years.
They effectively tracked a global intellectual in the United States.
Yeah.
And this isolation makes him incredibly bitter.
Understandably so.
He's furious at the NAACP. He's furious at the American government. He actually runs for the U.S. Senate in New York on the Progressive American Labor Party ticket, getting about 4% of the vote.
And his rhetoric regarding the Soviet Union becomes increasingly uncritical during this time.
Right. When Joseph Stalin dies, Dubois writes a glowing eulogy, praising the Soviet Union for outlawing race prejudice, completely ignoring the horrific purges and authoritarianism of the Soviet regime.
His perspective had narrowed. He was judging global regimes almost exclusively by their stated opposition to Western imperialism and racism.
If America, a democracy, treated him like a criminal, then America's enemy, the Soviet Union, must be the vanguard of human progress.
It's a tragic blind spot born of trauma and exhaustion. But his ultimate act of defiance comes in 1961. The Supreme Court upholds the McCarran Act, a law requiring members of the Communist Party to officially register with the government.
Dubois is 93 years old. He has never been a formal member of the party. But the moment the government mandates registration, he walks down and officially joins the Communist Party of the United States.
Yes.
He writes this public letter declaring that capitalism cannot reform itself. I look at this not as a deep embrace of Soviet ideology, but purely as a final, massive middle finger to McCarthyism and the American establishment.
It was a profound, total rejection of the American system. The country had ignored his data, lynched his people, betrayed him after World War I, and tried to cage him in his old age. He was officially done with the United States.
Right, this sets up his final act. In 1960, the Supreme Court rules that the government can't deny passports based on political beliefs. He finally gets his passport back.
And he receives a letter from Kwame Nkrumah.
Right. The president of the newly independent African nation of Ghana. Nkrumah invites Du Bois to come to Accra and direct a massive lifelong dream project, the Encyclopedia Africana, a comprehensive history of the African diaspora.
So at 93 years old, Du Bois and his second wife, Shuli Graham Du Bois, pack up their lives and move to West Africa.
And when the U.S. Embassy in Ghana refuses to renew his passport in 1963 because of his communist affiliation, he makes the ultimate symbolic gesture.
Yeah.
He renounces his American citizenship and becomes a citizen of Ghana.
Which is just a huge moment.
I want to pause here and just look at the personal contradictions of the man living out his final days in Ghana, because he's this radical, anti-capitalist, communist exile.
But he is living like a Victorian aristocrat.
Yes. He is an incredibly disciplined dandy. He wakes up at exactly 7:15 every morning. He still maps out his daily schedules and long-term goals on large sheets of precise graph paper.
He demands that everyone, even close associates, address him formally as Dr. Du Bois.
He walks the dusty, hot streets of Accra with a cane, wearing immaculately tailored three-piece suits with his mustache and goatee meticulously trimmed.
He never lost his profound sense of personal dignity and elite composure. He was also a bundle of religious contradictions.
How so?
He was fundamentally an agnostic, perhaps an atheist. He absolutely despised the hypocrisy of the American church, viewing it as a tool of segregation and complacency. When he was an administrator at Atlanta University, he famously refused to lead the student body in public prayer.
And yet, if you read his essays, his poetry, his editorials in the crisis, they are absolutely dripping with biblical, messianic, apocalyptic symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
He uses the language of Scripture constantly.
Because he was a master propagandist, he understood that while he personally rejected theology, the Black American masses were deeply rooted in the church.
Right.
If he wanted to move them, to inspire them to action, he had to speak their language. He repurposed the spiritual rhetoric of salvation and applied it to the earthly struggle for civil rights. He was a complex, contradictory, relentlessly brilliant human being.
He works on his encyclopedia right up until his body simply can't continue. His health declines, and he dies in his home in Accra, Ghana, on August 27, 1963. He was 95 years old.
And the timing of his death is one of the most profound poetic synchronicities in American history.
He died exactly one day before the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
The very next day.
Hundreds of thousands of people were gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. Martin Luther King Jr. is about to give his I Have a Dream speech. And Roy Wilkins, the executive secretary of the NAACP, the organization that had exiled Du Bois, stands at the podium.
Yes.
And he looks out at this massive sea of humanity, and he announces to the crowd that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois has passed away in Africa. He asked the entire crowd to honor him with a moment of silence.
Du Bois didn't live to see the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but that massive crowd, that entire movement, was standing on the intellectual scaffolding that he built.
From the Philadelphia Negro proving Black humanity with data, to the souls of Black folk defining the psychology of race,
to the founding of the NAACP providing the legal framework,
to the Pan-African Congresses defining the global struggle, he engineered the foundation of the modern world.
He really did.
As we wrap this up, I want you, the listener, to really reflect on the obsessive, unyielding dedication of this man's life. He didn't just have one career. He was a pioneering sociologist who mapped slums. He was an acclaimed novelist. He was a fierce, mudslinging propagandist.
He was a revisionist historian who rewrote the Civil War.
He was a global peace activist who faced down the federal government. He mapped his life on graph paper, and he relentlessly reinvented his tactics for 70 years, working until his dying breath at 95. What could you accomplish in your own life if you applied that level of disciplined, relentless reinvention to the things you care about?
His life proves that the pursuit of justice requires deep, uncomfortable adaptability. When empirical data failed to change minds, he turned to literature to change hearts.
When literature wasn't enough, he built a militant institution.
When that institution compromised, he turned to global geopolitics. He was willing to discard his own prior theories, to alienate his allies, and to face exile, so long as it pushed the needle forward. He never, ever stopped fighting.
Which brings us to our final thought.
Yeah.
Over a century ago, in 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois famously declared that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line.
Yeah.
If he were alive today, sitting here with us, looking at our modern data, the persistent wealth gaps, the disparities in the justice system, the rise of global nationalism, would he believe that we have finally solved the problem of the color line? Or would he pull out a fresh sheet of graph paper, boot up a digital version of the crisis, and tell us that we haven't erased the line at all, we simply painted it a different color?